Ukrainians had captured a lot of conscripts during the Kursk operation, and they were young people from places that could be St. Petersburg or Moscow, who were told that they would never be in a frontline battle, and the families of those were quite outraged that they had been captured when they shouldn't be anywhere near the front line, and that had put some pressure on Putin, and suddenly he was willing to negotiate this.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we are joined by Maxim Tucker. Maxim is the Times' Ukraine and Eastern Europe correspondent. He's been reporting from the front lines in Ukraine since 2022. Maxim, good to see you again. Thank you for your time. Really want to talk to you today about two in-depth reports that you've done recently on Ukraine's air defense tactics and also how it's protecting its grain exports at sea. But you're just back, or fairly recently back from Ukraine. Can you just give me an overview of your recent trip and how the people you met were and what you can tell me about their expectations in Ukraine at this moment?
So I think people in Ukraine are very worried about the situation in Donbass and how it's going to play out with so many troops moved into Kursk, into crossing the border into Russia and taking those defenses away from the Donbass. So there was a kind of great concern, particularly among the soldiers that I speak to, who are still holding the line in Donbass as to what's next for them and if they were ever going to get reinforcements or relief. The second thing that is really worrying Ukrainian society is this mobilization, the mass mobilization that's going ahead now of the Ukrainian men, with many men choosing to stay at home and try and avoid the draft, and others, signing up very reluctantly because they're concerned about how many people are being reported killed or wounded. And I think what's critical at this moment is all eyes are on Zelensky's visit to the US to see what will happen there. And if Ukraine can win some guarantees of security and additional hardware and all the things they desperately need in order to drive the Russians out of their territory.
How do you think the announcement the US will supply glide bombs to Ukraine will be received, and how much of a difference do you think that realistically will make?
I think it's very helpful. But what's key is lifting the restrictions on the use of these long-range weapons. So Ukraine needs to have US approval to strike targets inside Russia. It also, of course, it needs more aircraft in order to launch these glide bombs. So, the promise that the US will train an additional 16 F-16 pilots in the US next year is good, but it's not happening fast enough. It's not enough, and Ukrainians are still frustrated. They don't have enough pilots or planes in order to attack the Russian bases from where they're being attacked themselves.
Just want to now draw on those recent reports that you've written. Earlier this week, you did this really interesting deep dive into the planning and the evolution of Ukraine's tactics that destroyed an A-50 spy plane and damaged its airborne command center. Can you just start by telling us exactly what these aircraft are and how they've been operating?
So the A-50 is an equivalent to a NATO AWACS. It's basically a huge airborne radar which can see for hundreds of miles across territory and penetrate deep inside Ukraine. And the Russians have been flying them over the Azov Sea in order to get a great picture of what's happening in Ukrainian airspace. That allowed them to monitor Ukrainian jet activity, but also, drones and any missiles that would be fired across the border at Russia or at Russian troops inside Ukrainian territory. And this was a huge advantage that the Russians had over the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians haven't had this kind of capability. And in fact, the Ukrainians were able to shoot down two A-50s in kind of surprise ambushes, which involved, in one case, taking a very old Soviet missile system that had been decommissioned 11 years earlier, kind of re-engineering it, rebuilding, finding all the components, getting people who were familiar with this really antiquated system, putting it back together, and mounting it some 40 kilometers from the front line knowing the patrol route of one of these A-50s across the Azov Sea. They fired it at this A-50. They missed it the first time, but they inspired it was a Ukrainian military intelligence it was a Ukrainian military intelligence operation, and they inspired the Ukrainian Air Force to then take up their own action. And the Ukrainian Air Force drove a Patriot missile system with several other vehicles very, very close to the front line and ambushed another A-50 plane and shot it down at a range of nearly 200 kilometers. And the Ukrainians were then able to take the antiquated S-200 anti-aircraft system and shoot down a second A-50. And after that, the Russians simply couldn't put up any more A-50s. They didn't want to lose them. They're very valuable aircraft. And so the Ukrainians have effectively denied Russia radar view over Ukraine from these airborne aircraft. And at the same time, Ukraine is going to be getting Swedish airborne radar systems to look into Russian airspace. So the situation when they get those aircraft will change quite dramatically.
And just how risky an operation was it for the Ukrainian forces involved to take down those A-50s?
So it's incredibly risky for the Patriot battery that had to drive very, very close to the front line. We're talking 5 or 6 kilometers within artillery range of the Russians. It had to be very covert, very secretive mission, had to be done quickly, drive in, ambush the plane and drive back out. And they'd been trained by the Germans, actually, who provided this Patriot battery on trucks in this kind of operation. On the other hand, the S-200 is a completely static air defense system, and that had to be built over a number of days and then deconstructed over a number of days. So again, they had to take very good care to camouflage that and then evacuate the area in case there was retaliation, and then start dismantling it later at night over a period of a few days, and up to 13 kilometers of cables on that system.
It seems incredibly audacious, but also ingenious. And you talking to the people involved in coming up with this plan. I mean, how did they view it? What did they tell you? Presumably incredibly proud, but a very tricky operation to actually carry out.
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously proud of what they've done, and the significance of it is huge in destroying 2 aircraft which are worth $330 million each to build, and Russia is really struggling to replace them. I think the idea is always, these ideas are born out of necessity. If you have to do something, you find a way to do it. And the Ukrainians have demonstrated great ingenuity throughout the course of this conflict of solving problems that are causing them great difficulties.
How much of a dent has it actually been then to Russia's ability to control the skies?
Well, I was talking to Air Marshal Greg Bagwell the other day, who was telling me that this was a massive blow to Russia, not only in terms of the war with Ukraine, but also its ability to confront NATO. These are quite old aircraft. They're very difficult to build. They have a lot of specialist crew that are needed. And, in both instances, they lost the crew of these aircraft. There's decades of experience on that plane that could be used to train others. And they only have a handful of them. I think they're supposed to be less than 9 of these functioning A-50s. And he said that a lot of those will probably have already been cannibalized for spare parts. And the fact that Russia hasn't been able to put any more A-50s up into the air may demonstrate that the others are not flight worthy.
One of the factors behind the success was the element of surprise, wasn't it? That those aircrew never imagined they were within range. Can you explain another tactic the Ukrainians have been using, the so-called sambush? What is it and how is it being used?
So this is the idea that you take an anti-aircraft defense system, which you would primarily expect to be used to defend an area against aircraft or missiles, and use it in an offensive capacity instead of a defensive capacity. And that involves kind of driving it or placing it towards where the object that you're trying to attack is, and attacking it from very long range. And only a few of the Ukrainian systems have the capability to do this. The S-200 has a very long range. It can shoot down aircraft at high altitude, but it's not very maneuverable. So you can only hit something big like an A-50 or a strategic bomber. They also shot down, using the S-200, a Tu-22M3 nuclear-capable strategic bomber, which again affects the confrontation with NATO and Russia's ability to deliver nuclear weapons if it needs to. And the Patriot system has a shorter range, and that really had to go a lot closer to the front lines. But it's about using these objects, which are usually used in air defense in an offensive capacity. And the Ukrainians have also done this in Bryansk in May of last year. They shot down a number of planes over the Bryansk region of Russia, and they've done it over Krinky as well. And that's helped a lot with some of the glide bomb attacks on Ukrainian positions. But obviously the numbers of glide bombs are so vast that they still don't have enough Patriot systems and enough air defense systems to move around. And that's why Zelensky is in Washington at the moment saying we need more of these systems.
But yeah, another example, though, of ingenious ways of coming up with things out of necessity.
Right, and it's something that the Americans were really surprised because they don't use their Patriot systems in that way. They use them as a kind of area defense tool, and they defend strategic objects. But the Germans had at least envisaged using these in that way. Their Patriots are mounted on trucks and are much more mobile. So, and an American defense commander was saying, "This is something we hadn't witnessed in kind of 22 years of my career as an air defense commander." But the Germans were drilling the Ukrainians to kind of wake up in the early hours of the night, march somewhere, drive their vehicles somewhere to go back, fight an air defense battle, and then return. So this kind of fight, shoot and scoot, as it is known, is being applied across the Ukrainian forces, but very innovatively in air defense systems.
It's very interesting. On your recent travels, you also went to the vital city port of Odessa to report on naval efforts to keep the corridor open for grain exports. Can you tell us about the kind of vessels that are getting through and the kind of threats they're facing?
Yeah, so it's really important for Ukraine to keep its economy afloat. It's obviously a wartime economy. It's been really badly battered by Russia strangling its supply routes, taking over the Sea of Azov, and also kind of restrictions on the amount that you can export by road and by rail. So being able to reopen a sea route has been crucial to the Ukrainians. 70% of the agriculture of the exports of Ukraine, I think it's now even up to 90%, are agricultural. So they need to open that grain corridor. And when Russia unilaterally withdrew from the UN negotiated agreement, Ukraine sought to find a way to keep it open. And that has involved escorting kind of very large grain cargo ships through the 12 miles of territorial waters and then hugging the NATO allied coastline. So that's Bulgaria and Romania through to the Bosphorus and out into the Mediterranean through that way. But it's difficult because the Russians are obviously targeting the infrastructure and Ukrainian ports. They're laying mines in the way of these vehicles in territorial waters, and they're doing everything they can to disrupt this trade, including boarding some of the vessels, harassing them via radio, threatening to shoot them. And so the Ukrainian sailors, who often don't really talk about their work, were revealing some of the secrets of their engagements with the Russians and how they have been keeping this grain corridor open over the last year and a half.
And I understand from what you wrote that actually it's quite rare that they'd share their thoughts with you about this. Why did these Ukrainian sailors want to speak out?
So a lot of them are from occupied territory, and a lot of them would have served alongside the Russian military in Crimea. So they're very concerned about retaliation against their family members in occupied territory. And for that reason, we decided we didn't name them or give any of the identified details about the sailors. But they wanted to demonstrate how important this route is and some of the work that they'd been doing and how Russia is trying to disrupt it at a time when a Russian missile struck a cargo ship and it had to be rerouted to a port in Romania. So this is Russian attacks and behavior threatening civilian vessels. So they were talking about how the Russians had laid mines in the path of civilian vessels boarding these ships and basically acting as a very kind of reckless navy in international waters.
And I understand there was one particular incident you were told about involving a mine floating towards port. Can you describe what happened?
So this was just one example from the many that they talked about, but a particularly harrowing example of how one of these Russian mines, which they say was left over from World War II, floated into one of the Ukrainian seaports and had kind of lodged itself underneath a pier. And it was bobbing in the waves, and if it was a meter one way or the other, would hit the concrete and it would detonate. So this Navy cutter had to go into the port. A diver had to leap over the side of his small, rigid, inflatable boat, attach a cable to this very old and unstable mine, swim back to the boat to attach the other side of the cable, and they had to tow this mine out of the port with a distance of about 10 meters between them and the mine. So definitely, if they were hit, if the mine went off, they would definitely be hit by that. And it's just an incredible example of how these guys are going through this as a daily routine. They speak about it quite nonchalantly, but the stories that they tell are incredible.
Sounds like it. What kind of impact has all of this had on Ukraine's grain exports?
So it's allowed Ukraine to keep the routes open, but at kind of a lower number than previously. So before the war, I think they were exporting there were about 750 shipments per month. Now in the entire year, they'll have about 2,250 ships going through, servicing those ports. And they still have very important ports like Mykolaiv, which is one of Ukraine's largest ports, is not able to be used because the Russians are still occupying the Kinburn Spit, and it's very dangerous for the shipping to try and go past the Kinburn Spit. They'll be within artillery range of the Russians there. So it has had an impact on allowing Ukraine's economy to give basically a lifeline for Ukraine's economy, but it is much reduced, and it does show how difficult it is for Ukraine to maintain this economy and how reliant it is on Western partners at these times.
Can I just ask you a bit about the piece you're currently working on? As I understand it, it's about prisoner exchanges. What did you set out to do?
So I was very interested in how sporadic these prisoner exchanges are and what motivates them and how they come about, why it happens sometimes or why it's not consistent, what the Russians are asking for when they have these prisoner exchanges. And there was a very long hiatus in prisoner exchanges before Ukraine invaded the Kursk region of Russia. So I was looking at why that had been, and then suddenly there were mass prisoner exchanges after that. So the Ukrainians had captured a lot of conscripts during the Kursk operation, and they were young people from places that could be St. Petersburg or Moscow, who were told that they would never be in a frontline battle, and the families of those were quite outraged that they had been captured when they shouldn't be anywhere near the front line, and that had put some pressure on Putin, and suddenly he was willing to negotiate this. But the Ukrainians said that the reason these negotiations had slowed down before was that all of the kind of Russian contract soldiers and kind of prisoners and people that had been captured before, the Russians weren't really interested in retrieving them, and they were only interested in extracting as much as they could, as many concessions as they could from the Ukrainians in order to get the Ukrainian prisoners back. The Ukrainians are very keen on bringing back their people. And the one person that I spoke to who's party to this negotiation said it was something like an 18th century slave market. It wasn't a humanitarian mission. It wasn't a humanitarian exercise. The Russians just wanted to get as many of their people out in return for as few Ukrainians being released as possible. And every time the Ukrainians would go to the negotiating table, the Russians would come back with some ridiculous demand that they were unable to meet.
Did you learn much about the process?
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting process. So the Russians don't have a coordination center in the same way that Ukrainians have. It's not very organized. The Ukrainians have to reach out to different people. They were talking about how Kadyrov is very interested in getting his Chechens back. So if you capture a Chechen, that's great because you almost certainly will get a prisoner of war back in exchange for a Chechen. But the Russian government is not really interested in it. And the Ukrainians have informal routes with people that, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, so-called republics that Russia set up in 2014. The Ukrainians have links to some of those, and they're able to negotiate with them on those bases.
And there's one particular story that you featured. Can you tell me a bit more about the woman, the veteran? She's a serving soldier, is that right?
She's a former soldier, so a former combat medic who was fighting in Mariupol, and she was captured during the defense of Azovstal, along with her husband, who was in a separate fighting unit. And they were held in Russia for a period of time after the fall of Azovstal. She was then released as part of a prisoner exchange, but her husband was not. He stayed in Russia. And she has desperately been trying to get her husband back after this and facing blockage. And it's very difficult for the families, even on the Ukrainian side, because the process is quite opaque. And the Ukrainian Coordination Center says, look, it's actually unhelpful for us to name who we want, because if we say who we want to the Russians, they try and extract a higher price from us. So we're kind of dealing with, we give them the list, but then see what happens.
It sounds absolutely agonizing. I mean, is it possible to say how long she may have to wait or what her chances of success are?
Well, in the most recent prisoner exchange, there were some people who were captured at Azovstal released. So, we were with her at the time, and she got these text messages from other families who were welcoming home their loved ones. And, obviously there was some excitement and hope in her that maybe her husband was one of these. And then obviously disappointment when she realized that he wasn't among them. But these every time there's a prisoner exchange, it brings some hope to these families. Then obviously it's devastating when it's not their loved ones. And there's still about more than 1,000 prisoners from Azovstal on the Russian side, and they've been in captivity for really a very long time.
Yeah, and just finally, Maxim. I mean, it's interesting time. President Zelensky in New York. I'm just wondering how much anxiety you think there is in the country, in Ukraine, about the politics surrounding the war, the talk of victory or peace, and the winter coming, along with a new U.S. president.
Yeah, it's a very anxious time. Huge changes are afoot. The Russians are obviously focusing on Ukrainian energy infrastructure again, attacking that. The winter is going to be very, very hard. If it's a cold winter, it will be a tragedy for Ukraine, and we'll see again millions of people potentially leaving Ukraine and heading to Europe as a result of this. And at the same time, Zelensky has made this gamble to invade Kursk to try and show the West that Putin's red lines, his nuclear bluffs, his nuclear deterrence is really a bluff, and that the West must lift these restrictions on using Western weapons against Russian logistical hubs inside Russia. And at the same time, you have these Russian advances in Pokrovsk and Vuhledar, which are really important for the Ukrainian defense there. So it feels like a lot hangs in the balance. I mean, we've been saying that a lot throughout the war. And the trouble is that the West realizes it a little bit too late every time and offers something which comes a little bit too late every time. There's still an opportunity for the West to provide the weapons and remove the restrictions that would allow Ukraine to deal enough of a blow to the Russians to bring them to the negotiating table. Otherwise, we're kind of.
And just for the record, I should say, Maxim, it's 2:30 in London on Thursday, the 26th of September. At the moment, no news on that, but we will wait and we will watch, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it again. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.